The government doesn't want you to read comic books. This isn't some kind of what-if story. This isn't some kind of Elseworlds. It's not an imaginary tale. This is the way that things actually happened. This is the most important event in comic book history. This explains everything. This explains why the comic book market in the United States is the way that it is. It explains why it's so different than the way that it is in Japan or Korea. This is the reason why comic books are forever looked upon as just like kid stuff. This is part of the reason why people get bullied for liking comic books. This is part of the reason why, like, even though these characters exist in comic books, the comic book industry is always seemingly on the verge of collapse, whereas they're making huge splashes and owning Hollywood, the same characters. This explains all of it. But before I can explain just exactly how this changed our present, we need to take a little bit of a look back at what the world was like before this event, before the United States government slaughtered the comic book industry.
News of the world. Take a trip back to the golden age of comics. Those thrilling years between 1938 and 1950, when comic books were as common as apple pie and just as beloved. Why, you couldn't swing a stick without hitting a comic book rack at the local drugstore, the grocers, or even the corner newsstand. Kids clamored for them as a reward for tagging along on mom's errands. Soldiers found them tucked into care packages overseas, and teenagers devoured tales of daring drama and romance made just for them. Yes, sir, comic books were the pastime of the people, but they weren't just for fun. No, sirree, comics were a mirror of their times, reflecting the hopes and fears of an America at war. Heroes like Captain America, Batman, and Superman leapt off the pages to take on enemies that bore more than a passing resemblance to the real-world villains of the day. The war was over. No longer tethered to the tales of wartime heroics, comics branched out like never before. Westerns came galloping into the spotlight. Romance tales tugged at teenage heartstrings. Horror gave folks a good old-fashioned scare.
So it all begins in 1948. There was a symposium, and this symposium was hosted and run by a lot of other psychiatrists, psychologists, just a bunch of people working together on this. And the headliner of this particular event was a guy named Dr. Fredric Wertham, and he's the guy who's going to be really, really important to understand here. And he's important to understand here because it's his work that starts the entire downfall of the comic book industry. Now, to be fair, Fredric Wertham, the guy we're going to be talking a lot about today, he did some really great stuff. So one of the things he did was he set up mental health clinics in places like Harlem, poorer neighborhoods where people could get help pretty readily. And a lot of his work was also very foundational and referenced in Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the Supreme Court case that helped end segregation in schools. But he's not really remembered for that, and it seems like a lot of his work really wasn't geared towards that. It's like he accomplished that and now he's done. His big thing that he's remembered for, his thesis, his white whale, was the comic book industry. Ever since 1948, he published a few articles here and there, some of them in really high-profile magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Scouting. Scouting was another one where he wrote an article about the dangers of comic books geared towards kids. But his biggest thing, his biggest work, the thing that made him a huge name in the United States was his book, Seduction of the Innocent, published in 1953. It's long. Wow, was it long. The book itself is 400 pages, but the prose in it just feels longer than that. Oh my gosh. His conjectures are wild. They come from the craziest places. His numbers and statistics are extremely inconsistent throughout it. And the whole thing reeks of, well, think of the children, and that's about as deep as it gets. And that was within like a few pages, and I just couldn't keep reading. But fortunately, or rather unfortunately, unfortunate for history, fortunate for my research, the book was summarized in a magazine called Ladies' Home Journal, and under the title, What Parents Don't Know About Comic Books, with a cover date of November 1953. It's still very long, though. The book just... The magazine article goes on for pages and pages and pages and has the same problems that the book has, which makes sense. It is a summary of the book, where it's just wild conjectures, none of the numbers are consistent. But he also makes it very clear in no uncertain terms at the end of the article what his goals are.
Whenever you hear a public discussion of comic books, you will hear sooner or later an advocate of the industry say with a triumphant smile, "Comic books are here to stay." I do not believe it. Parents will realize that comic books are not a necessary evil. I am convinced that in some way or another, the democratic process will assert itself, and crime comic books will go, and with them all they stand for, all that sustains them. But before they can tackle Superman, Dr. Payne, and a myriad of incarnations, people will have to learn that freedom is not something that one can have, but is something one must do.
Something we need to talk about here is how Wertham defined comics. He talked a lot about something called crime comics. If you read his work, all over it, he'll specifically define crime comics. Now, crime comics at the time were a subgenre of comics. They were kind of like detective stories with a little bit of a darker spin to them. But usually, the good guys ended up winning in them. But that's beside the point. Anything that was defined as a crime comic, according to Wertham, though, was anything that mentioned or thought about crime in any sense. So it wasn't just these crime detective stories, it was all detective stories. It was all superhero stories. It was all Western stories. It was a good chunk of romance stories he threw in there as well. Basically, anything that he specifically called this out, anything that wasn't a Disney comic was what he was going after. Disney comics were fine. I love Disney comics. Disney comics are great. And coincidentally, during all this time, Disney comics really thrived. How about that? And again, to make sure we're being fair to Wertham and everyone else who's involved here, he wasn't the first, and he wasn't the only one. Remember, there was that 1948 symposium. He was one of the speakers. There were several other psychotherapists and psychiatrists and psychologists and all of them who were all thinking about kind of the same thing, but also, in fairness to everyone who was involved, it wasn't like the comic book industry was complacent in the kinds of content that it put out to kids. You had an actual rating system that was in place for comics already. It was based off of the movie rating system that was being used at the time. And also, this was a pretty solid defense, I think, that was brought up later by, we're going to hear about him a lot, William Gaines. He was the publisher of Entertainment Comics, which published a lot of horror comics as well as some comedies. If your kid is picking up a book that has like horror elements on it, on the cover, it's pretty safe to say it's going to have those elements on the inside as well. Like there is an easy way to monitor what your kids are intaking, and it's by looking at how the comic book presents itself. Here's some quotes from him that I find very interesting. Now, this does come with a bit of a trigger warning. I've seen statements that are less crazy get trigger warnings in front of them, so just a quick trigger warning. to kind of really drive home just what this guy thought of comic books. The Batman type of story may stimulate children to homosexual fantasies, of the nature of which they may be unconscious. Robin is a handsome, amphibic boy, usually shown in his uniform with bare legs. He is buoyant with energy and devoted to nothing on Earth or interplanetary space, as much as Bruce Wayne. He often stands with his legs spread and genital region discreetly evident. For boys, Wonder Woman is a frightening image. For girls, she is a morbid ideal. Where Batman is anti-feminine, the attractive Wonder Woman and her counterparts are definitely anti-masculine. And Superman is the direct translation of the Übermensch. Superman himself is the symbol of force, power, and violence, and that is what he represents. And that has had an enormous influence we cannot possibly exaggerate on the youth not only of this country, but especially the youth of other countries, especially Germany. It isn't impossible to understand what happened in Germany, all of those massacres, unless you understand they had the Superman spirit. Yeah, so he's homophobic, he's anti-feminist, beyond that, he's anti-humanist. The way that he talks about Robin makes me question some things, unfortunately. But did he really somehow just blame World War II on Superman? Now, admittedly, I cheated a little bit here. The first two quotes, the ones about Batman and Robin and the one about Wonder Woman, those ones did come from Seduction of the Innocent. The Superman one came from 1981. Yeah, decades after this. He's still going on about it. And like, these are just the crazy things that he would go on and say for his entire life. Now, you think people would see quotes like this and be like, wow, this guy is bonkers. This guy is completely off his rocker. This is so far-fetched, like, it's so far-fetched that dogs don't even want to go fetch it. Like, it's just, what in the world? But nothing could be further from the truth. Parents and community groups really latched onto what Wertham had to say. You had churches get together and ban books. You had parents get together and ban books. Schools, other community groups. You had people send their children door to door to pick up comic books and publicly burn them. Let me say that again in case you missed it. Community groups would send their children door to door to pick up comic books and then publicly burn them. I wonder what imagery that brings up. We would have instances here where entire cities, Oklahoma City, Houston, Detroit, Ann Arbor, they passed laws limiting the sale of comic books. Los Angeles tried to pass a similar law, but it ended up failing because the people stood up and said, actually, I think this might be a little bit unconstitutional. Good for them. And it's not like the industry took this lying down either. If you look at various comic book titles from the time, you'll see articles printed in the back of them behind the stories just explaining everything that is wrong with Wertham's research and everything that was broken about it. And then you would have people, especially William Gaines. He was the publisher of EC Comics. EC Comics was a big horror publishing group as well as some comedy. EC stands for Entertainment Comics. He was very outspoken about this. But ultimately, it wasn't enough.
But there was a psychiatrist named Fredric Wertham who had written a book called Seduction of the Innocent. And in that book, he claimed that comic books were responsible for virtually all of the ills that flesh is heir to. It was great for him. He got a lot of publicity. It was terrible for the comic book business. I found it so depressing because he had been a hero of mine. Very few people know this, but he had also written other books before he wrote Seduction of the Innocent. One of the books he wrote, I don't know why, but I had picked it up as a 14 or 15-year-old kid, and I read this book. And again, it's not the type of thing I usually read. I don't know where I got it or why, but it was the story of a boy who killed his mother, I think. Or it was a really terrible case, a psychological case history, a true case. And I read it, and I felt it was so well written and so engrossing, and it was a fantastically told story for a true case. And I always remembered his name, and I thought this must be a brilliant man. And then when he came along as the arch foe of comics, and I violently disagreed with everything he claimed, and I felt he was a real opportunist and a rabble-rouser, you can't imagine how disillusioned I was.
Eventually, things got so bad that the United States Senate had to get involved, and they created what they called the Senate Subcommittee for Juvenile Delinquency. They didn't do any of that. It was just a witch hunt for comic books. They brought Dr. Wertham on to their subcommittee, and they just attacked the comic book industry. Many of the publishers at the time couldn't survive. A lot of them ended up just falling away. They got boycotted into oblivion. And basically, at the end of these Senate hearings, they said, look, either you find a way to censor yourselves, or we will just shut down the whole industry. We don't care. We're fine shutting down the industry if it gets people off our backs about it. And so, backed up against the wall with churches and with parent groups and with the power of the United States government bearing down on them, the comic book community and comic book publishers created the Comics Code Authority. The Comics Code Authority was this group that would review every comic book published, and if you passed their regulations, then you got a little stamp on the front of your comic saying that you were approved by the Comics Code Authority, and you needed this, because if you didn't have that stamp, then you couldn't get sold anywhere. People wouldn't carry your book. Because remember, at the time, there wasn't really such a thing as a comic book store. Comic books were sold everywhere. They were sold in grocery stores. They were sold in corner stores. They were sold at gas stations. They were sold at newsstands. You go grocery shopping, you pick up a comic book, but if you didn't have the stamp, your book couldn't be carried by anyone. The rules for the Comics Code Authority were ridiculous. Scott McCloud, great comic book historian and comic book analyst, love the guy. He said that this is like taking the standards you need to make your movie rated G and then turning it up to 11. This is way deeper. Here's just some of the rules. 1. Crime shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. The letters of the word crime on a comics magazine cover shall never be appreciably greater in dimension than other words contained in the title. The word crime shall never appear alone on a cover. And now here's the tricky rules, and this is where you could tell things were a little bit targeted, because if you remember, William Gaines, he was the publisher that spoke out at these committees, and he ran a horror publishing group. Check out these rules. No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism, there's the word, shall not be permitted. All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. What does that one even mean? That one's up to interpretation, and that was up to interpretation. There were a lot of times where art would get sent forward and then it would get sent back just because it was ugly, I guess. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires or vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, or werewolfism are forbidden. So you couldn't have vampires, you couldn't have werewolves, you couldn't have zombies in your comic book. So no classic monsters. Special precautions to avoid references to physical afflictions or deformities shall be taken. A physical affliction or deformity. What if my character is in a wheelchair? That's... what if they're like an old war hero and they lost a leg or an arm? Does that go up against this? We could never know. It's up to the interpretation of the committee. A lot of these rules felt extremely targeted towards horror comics because by far and away the person who was most outspoken about this was William Gaines, the horror publisher. So, look at this. You can't have any references to the undead. You can't have any references to werewolves or zombies or vampires. It's like, well, what else is there? And then beyond that, some of these rules were extremely vague and up to the interpretation of whoever was just looking at the book at the time. How would you know that it was compliant with the rules? You wouldn't know. You wouldn't know until it got sent out and then it got sent back to you. And then you had to read it then and find out. Now, because of this, the industry really had to just go really simple with all of their work. We've talked about this before, but DC Comics, they basically turned all of their books into some kind of comedy. They rehashed the same comedic plot lines over and over and over. If I had a nickel for every time Lana Lang was convinced that she found out Clark Kent was Superboy, that's like the beginning and end of the Superboy comics. That's a little unfair. They had some great stuff in there, but you get what I'm saying. It was a lot of comedy. And then you had Marvel. Marvel found a secret formula that worked, where they just made soap operas, but with superheroes in them. But because this went so simple, you had unique problems pop up where now advertising was strictly for kids because the books had been so kidified that it was clear they were just for children. They took out any chance of mature conversation happening within these comics to where adults didn't care anymore. Now, eventually, people started to see a lot of the holes that were in Wertham's work. For one, he had a nasty habit for a logical fallacy called hasty generalization, which is where you take a very, very small sample size and you attribute that anomaly to the whole. Let me explain. When he did his research, he didn't research a ton of people. He didn't interview a ton of kids. And the few select kids he did interview were kids that were already in juvenile homes. So he was already talking to troubled kids, and the only thing he found in common amongst all of them was that they read comic books. And then in the very next breath, he would talk about how there are, 90 million comics bought and read every single month by kids. And he would attribute this small sample size to this huge sample size. And it's that's not a very good correlation. That's not very general. That's like saying today that if you have a smartphone, you are some kind of heinous criminal. It's the exact same thing here. He also had a big problem reading statistics. There's one in there that he talks about how juvenile delinquency increased by 20% since the end of the war to the mid-50s. But here's the thing. So did the number of kids. Everything grew that much in that amount of time. It was a huge boom. And so he wasn't taking that into account. He wasn't taking into account that crime was increasing, but it wasn't necessarily because poor behavior was increasing because the kids were increasing. Not to mention his habit for hyperbole or making things seem so much more grand and important for the sake of having his audience look at him and say, oh, look at how cool he is. Look at some of the things that this guy thought of himself. A natural scientist who had looked over comic books expressed this to me tersely. In comic books, life is worth nothing. There is no dignity of a human being. Or this one. This one is very self-centered. I have sometimes indulged in the fantasy that I am at the gates of heaven. St. Peter questions me about what good I have done on earth. I reply proudly that I have read and analyzed thousands of comic books, a horrible task, and really a labor of love. That counts for nothing, says St. Peter. Millions of children read these comic books. Well, I reply, I have also read all the articles and speeches and press releases by experts for the defense of comic books. Okay, says St. Peter, come in, you deserve it. Or this cute little statement right here, I think Hitler was a beginning compared to the comic book industry. Dude, you're German! What in the world? Why would you say that? what the heck? Eventually, though, his reputation just tanked. And people stopped taking him seriously. He wrote about comic books like a couple more times. And the last time he did was for a fanzine where it felt like he was backpedaling a little bit in his old age, where he was trying to talk about how fan fiction is a great outlet for people to express their inner desires and interact with characters, which wasn't well received. And then he was invited to a Comic-Con where he was booed and heckled the entire time. And then he stopped talking about comic books and writing about comic books in general. Soon after he died, and some people were looking through his stuff, and they found an unfinished manuscript for a sequel to Seduction of the Innocent, this time attacking cartoons and TV. So, the book was never finished, and apparently neither was Wertham. He just wasn't going to stop. Now, as far as the Comics Code Authority is concerned, the guidelines for it started shrinking, gradually over the next, 60-ish years. And the importance of the stamp, you could see how important the stamp was over time, because it was huge at the beginning, and then it just started shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until it was barely noticeable. And then in 2001, Marvel submitted an X-Force comic to the code, and they sent it back with some requested changes. And then they said, there's no reason to send it back to the authority. We could just publish it, because by this point, comic books weren't being sold everywhere. They had been cut back substantially to where it was basically novelty shops and comic book stores that were selling them, and they didn't care. And Marvel recognized this, and they stopped sending books to the authority. Archie and DC kept sending them until about 2011, when DC tried to send it, and they found that all that was remaining of the authority was a single person who was just reading tons of comic books and putting the stamp on them, so they just gave up. And Archie soon followed after. Now, if you look at Marvel and DC, if you look at their comic books, you will see a rating at the bottom near the barcode, and that's the new system that they go with. It's a proprietary system within the publishing houses, and you can see their guidelines if you look at it. So the authority just kind of died. And ironically, the rights to things like the stamp were bought up by a group called the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund was born out of the drama that came from the Comics Code Authority and all of the government censorship and government mandated censorship that comics had to go through. And now their whole mission is they keep an eye out for book bannings and comic book bannings. They keep an eye out looking for that, and then they help fund the legal processes to protect the books, to protect the rights of readers, and to get these books out of being banned. They're doing great work over there. Go check out their website, check out what they're doing. And they're always looking for volunteers and donations. See what you can do to help. But the importance of how long the Comics Code Authority and how widespread these hearings were cannot be understated. We can still feel the effects of these hearings and the code. You had Marvel and DC, who basically just had to rely on their superhero publishing, and now forevermore, they will only be seen as superhero companies. They used to publish a huge, wide variety of genres. Now it's just superheroes. The strict kid-proofing of comic books made it so that comics seemed like they were a kid-only medium, which in a roundabout way means that there's more ammo to bully people who are still into it. Why are you into comic books? That's kid stuff. You weird kid-dolt. That's a word that was thrown around a couple years back. And since Japan didn't have this censorship problem, you can see what would have happened to our comic book industry if it just continued to thrive. Comic books are for everybody. They have some for kids, they have some for teenagers, they have some for adults. And we have that too, but it took us decades to be able to do that again. And a part of the consequence now. If you look at market shares for comic books in the United States, American-made comics only has about 30% of total sales. Most of it comes from Japan and Korea. So, that is the way that it really happened. That is the way that the comic book industry got its whole growth stunted and held back because of unnecessary literature censorship. Now, because this all happened in the past, and it's largely over, it took like 60 years, but it's largely over now, we can see just what were the events that led to all of this. You had a brand new world. This new generation was coming in and starting to raise their own kids that they don't recognize. Remember, these were a bunch of Depression-era kids, and now they're in a post-World War II world where everything is bigger, everything is grander and new and sparkling and shiny and kind of scary. And then you had people who showed up and played on those fears. You had Dr. Wertham, who, even though his work and his statistics and his numbers and his proof were just not there, people didn't care. People were too scared to pay attention. And so you'd have a whole bunch of parents that instead of reading Wertham's articles and books and then checking to see what their kids were reading, they just took it at face value. And then they started complaining. And then you had churches play into it. And then you had schools play into it. And eventually the United States Senate. And all the while you had various people across this timeline here that wanted this to happen because it helped further their own agendas. Because frankly, there are a lot of places where if you get scared and the people are scared, other people will benefit. Other people will advance and they will fulfill their goals at the expense of yours. But what am I talking about? All this happened in 1954. This kind of censorship stuff doesn't happen anymore, right?
My name is D. Snyder, that's S-N-I-D-E-R. I'm 30 years old, I'm married, I have a 3-year-old son. I was born and raised a Christian, and I still adhere to those principles. Believe it or not, I do not drink, I do not smoke, and I do not do drugs.
Enchantments, fetishes, potions, spells, Dungeons and Dragons, occult games like that. Now, if you've dabbled in any of these, you're cursed. Your children are cursed. Your grandchildren are cursed. Your great-grandchildren are cursed.
He was asked if he's going to ban TikTok here in the United States.
We're looking at TikTok. We may be banning TikTok.
In 1928, the city of Chicago banned a book known as The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from all of its public libraries. Local leaders claimed that the book would have, quote, an ungodly influence on its readers.
Son, what is that one morning? He said, that's Pokemon. Pokemon, plural, are incredible creatures that share the world with humans.
I do play in and write the songs for a rock and roll band named Twisted Sister, and I pride myself on writing songs that are consistent with my above-mentioned beliefs.
2 decades later, in 1873, Congress passed the Comstock Act, a law that mandated up to 5 years in prison for any person who sold or distributed a book that was, quote, obscene, lewd, or lascivious. The law did not define the terms, and hundreds of Americans were convicted for distributing books about topics such as atheism and reproductive health.
A credible rating system will help parents determine which games are appropriate for children of different ages, and that is exactly what our proposed legislation contemplates. But I must say here that creating a rating system is, in my opinion, the very least the video game industry can do, not the best they can do.
We have always promoted the belief that rock and roll should not be sexist, but should cater to males and females equally.
They have millions and millions of U.S. users. Right. They're probably the most popular social media app among people under age 20.
You said today, as you often say, that you live in Singapore. You ever applied for Chinese citizenship?
Senator, I served my nation in Singapore. No, I did not.
As video showed, this committee itself held a series of hearings in 1954 to examine the threat that comic books like Superman pose to children.
I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wertham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid.
The anti-comics panic culminated in the industry's comics code that censored comic books for decades. That may seem absurd today, but extremists continue to fight popular graphic novels like Mouse and other books.
That is, it is my job as a parent to monitor what my children see, hear, and read during their preteen years. The full responsibility for this falls on the shoulders of my wife and I because there is no one else capable of making these judgments for us.
TikTok isn't just another social media platform. TikTok is a Chinese communist spy app. Have you ever been a member of the Chinese Communist Party?
Senator, I'm Singaporean. No.
Have you ever been associated or affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party?
No, Senator. Again, I'm Singaporean.
They say the Pokemon whole effort is to train children how to become the #1 Pokemon master in the world. Masters are those who take control of spirits in the dark realm.
What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too, and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children are so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded, that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
Parents can thank the PMRC for reminding them that there is no substitute for parental guidance, but that is where the PMRC's job ends.
So Pokemon is a game that teaches children how to enter into the world of witchcraft, how to cast spells, how to use psychic phenomena, how to put to work supernatural powers against their enemies, how to fantasy role play. Pokemon World is a world of the demonic.
I'm tired of running into kids on the street who tell me that they can't play our records anymore because of the misinformation their parents are being fed by the PMRC on TV and in the newspapers.
In 2022, there were over 1,000 requests to ban books at public schools and libraries, the most in almost 20 years. Unfortunately, there is a long history in our country of banning books we now consider classic works of literature.